My name is Tom Harris, and this is Exploratory Journeys. My guest today is Joseph Benamy, a Canadian conservative writer, strategist, and organizer. He is a principal consultant with Ditchley Public Affairs, a Canadian-based strategic communications and political marketing firm, and sits on the board of bluecommittee.org. Joseph has held senior positions in several local, provincial, and national political and advocacy campaigns. He served as a policy aide to former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper and operations director for Stockwell Day, former leader of the Canadian Alliance. Most recently, he managed the campaign of Brad Trost for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. And Joseph, welcome to the show, first of all.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Yeah, Brad Trost was, in fact, pretty well the only candidate who was promoting a realistic view of climate change. Can you tell us more about Mr. Trost?
Well, sure. Brad is by training, he's a geophysicist. And in fact, he did quite a bit of mining exploration up north before he decided to run for Parliament. And so, although it wasn't a major plank in the platform, he understood clearly that climate change is not exclusively or even mainly caused by human activity. Nobody can definitively deny that human activity doesn't affect climate. I think that the question is still out there as to what degree that might be. But his position was that, it was just bunk. It was just, it was as the term we used to throw around was fake science. And mostly promoted by activists who latch on to the idea by some scientists that this is a problem that's predominantly man-made. And then they promote this, and it becomes sort of like policy making by who shouts the loudest and the longest, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a classic example of the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? So if you can manage to become the squeaky wheel, but of course that's not scientific at all. And I'm not speaking as a scientist. I'm just speaking as, a lay person when it comes to science who has a basic education. Mm-hmm. I don't think it takes a particular specialization in any scientific field to be able to recognize when, the wool's being pulled over your eyes somewhat.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And in the recent Conservative convention, they tried to get an official policy statement that climate change is real, which is a little like, as one of the policy representatives said, he said, well, that's like saying water is wet. I mean, what do you think was the point behind declaring climate change is real as part of your platform?
Well, I'm not going to defend the move. I thought that introducing a motion of this kind, knowing how laden it is with controversy, particularly within the Conservative Party, I think was a bad political move. It was bad tactically, bad strategically. What does it mean? Well, who's going to deny that climate change is real? There are a small number of people that will, but the majority of people are, I think, like me. I go, well, of course climate change is real. Gosh, because I remember when I was in fourth grade visiting the Museum of Natural History or whatever it is here in Ottawa, and being fascinated by the fact that here we were in the middle of winter. It's minus 45 degrees outside, and they're talking about how this used to be a tropical paradise.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, what was the cause of that? I don't know, but
climate change is real.
That's a pretty, even back then I understood, okay, climate changes.
Yeah.
It changes over long periods, drastically over long periods of time. It changes maybe not so drastically over short periods of time. So what is causing climate change? I don't know. I'm not a scientist. But as I said, I have a pretty good basic education. And I understand that, when the wool's being pulled over my eyes by activists.
Yeah, exactly.
Going back to the convention, Tom, as I said, I don't think anybody really denies that climate change is real. The issue is whether or not the leadership of the party was prepared to use or was planning on using that resolution passing as cover for introducing a whole range of policy initiatives that aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions rather than through taxation and discouraging people from their day-to-day practice that may be generating greenhouse gas emissions through taxation or through some sort of an onerous regulatory regime, which is the direction that the Conservative Party has been leaning in recent years, trying very hard to address climate change and to slow down climate change, but trying to do so in a way that is substantially different from what the Liberals are doing, which is the taxation route. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's the same thing. And I think for the majority of delegates of the convention, they understand that it's the same thing as well. And they weren't prepared, even on such an innocuous resolution, they weren't prepared to give the leadership of the party that kind of political cover.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they vote against it. But of course, there were so many different levels where this was a bad idea in introducing the motion, because you're justifying it basically saying, well, we want to take away the Liberals' opportunity to call us climate change deniers, thereby setting the table for the argument that if you vote against this resolution, you're a climate change denier.
Right. So they're asking for a hit from the Liberals.
Well, exactly. and Rule 101, or maybe not Rule 101, but let's call it Rule 101C-4, okay? In political communications is you do not accept the premise of your opponent, okay? Now, maybe you're going to accept the premise if you actually agree with them, okay? But I don't think that in this case that Aaron O'Toole and the leadership team, the people around him, actually believe that if you don't agree that climate is changing as a result of human activity, that makes you a climate change denier. Mm-hmm. So why even mention it as part of your justification for introducing a resolution? Now, that's not a scientific argument. That's not an argument for or against climate change or any particular policy. That's strictly a communications technique argument.
Oh, yeah. And I understand they didn't prepare for it properly. I was reading in the newspaper that usually resolutions are thoroughly vetted ahead of time, and before they even get to the convention, they know exactly what's going to happen. Whereas in this case, apparently they didn't do their homework.
Well, I don't know. I can't speak to that. I'm not in the inner circle. I wasn't involved, and in fact, I didn't even attend the convention virtually for a number of reasons. So I don't really know whether that's the case or not. You would expect that if the leader is going to support a particular resolution, that some groundwork would be done in advance of the tabling of that resolution and a vote to ensure that the delegates are actually going to support it. So It's you either take their temperature through some sort of a polling mechanism, and if it looks close, then you spend some time twisting a few arms, persuading people. Mm-hmm. Maybe twisting a few arms is probably
before the convention, so that you make sure that you get over the top. If it looks like it's going to go down in flames, you don't introduce it at all, and you find some way of not introducing it. So again, this is just politics 101. Mm-hmm. So the net result was that they gave the Liberals great ammunition to attack them in the House of Commons as being climate change deniers. It did the exact opposite of what they were trying to do.
And it's a self-inflicted wound.
Yeah.
And it's really quite unfortunate. Is it a fatal wound? I don't know.
Well,
but I will say this. I do think that Mr. O'Toole has to do a better job. Mm-hmm. And I think if you ask him, he'll tell you that too. I mean, he's a decent person. He's not a fool.
Yeah.
But there were some significant fundamental communication errors that were made, and I don't know. I was telling on a show last night. I was talking to my co-host actually, and I was saying that in some places that kind of, dare I call it, an ineptitude would be a firing offense. Mm-hmm. I think it's really more an indication of inexperience. And the idea, again, this is kind of the environment we're in politically, Tom, on many issues, where, if people are not used to debate, they're not used to actually critical thinking, subjecting their own thoughts and their own positions to critical thinking. And so, I could very well see how they had a communications meeting and someone came up with the idea of, well, let's do this.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody immediately buys into it. And nobody's at the back of the room like I, used to do, sort of put my hand up and go, okay, well, has anyone actually thought about the unintended consequences of this maybe not going through as smoothly? Forget about going the opposite direction. Just maybe it's not going to go quite as smoothly as you're assuming. And so there's too much assumption. But that's a broader problem in our society. I don't see that as being just the conservatives. I see the liberals doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, then it gets on to the topic of he wants to have emissions control as Canada's contribution to climate change. And of course, it doesn't even matter whether you think we're causing dangerous climate change or not. Canada's emissions are inconsequential. In fact, in my article in the Toronto Sun today, it's about the ideal plan for the Conservatives not being emissions reduction but adaptation. I point out that, okay, if you believe that there's a climate crisis, then what we do will have no impact. If you don't believe there's a climate crisis, then what we do will have no impact. So the whole point of emissions control for Canada is pointless. And yet they're charging ahead on this. I guess it's a form of virtue signaling. Do you think there's any chance that they'll actually realize that, yeah, this is simply doing out-liberaling the Liberals?
Well, you can't out-liberal the Liberals in virtue signaling. That's for sure. But, there's an assumption amongst the strategists right now in control of the party that, if you don't have a viable climate change policy, a credible climate change policy, that you can't win an election.
And it has to be emissions controlled.
Well,
they seem to think.
Well, that's the question. The question really comes down to, well, what is a sensible and credible plan to react to climate change? And everybody's caught in this sort of feedback loop over stopping climate change or slowing it down by reducing so-called greenhouse gas emissions, okay? My position and the position of a lot of people who are active in conservative circles is to say, look, and I'm not coming at this from a scientific point of view, I'm just coming at this from a common sense point of view.
Yeah.
If we as Canadians are only producing somewhere in the order of 1.5, 1.6% of all greenhouse gas emissions, okay, then we could eliminate all of our emissions, okay, tomorrow, and it's not going to make a difference. So the first question that I think any Canadian government has to ask themselves, and frankly any government around the world, okay, is what exactly is in the interests of the people who are electing us and paying our taxes, taxes.
Canadians, Canadian voters.
What we need in this country is a made in Canada climate change policy. And the only sensible climate change policy that a Canadian government should adopt is getting ready for climate change.
Yeah,
or adapting to it.
Yeah, exactly.
And the reason is very simple, because nothing we're going to do in this country is going to affect climate change, and it doesn't matter what the cause is. It's either happening because it's natural, or it's happening because, bad human beings are doing what they're doing. But either way, if we stop, all of a sudden, hitting the brakes on development and all of the other consequences that come along with a so-called net zero. And it's funny, nobody says zero emissions. It's always net zero.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? And nobody even knows what net zero really means. It's just one of those terms out there, right? So
it means that we have to compensate for our emissions in some way so that the net absorption, net release is zero when you add the two up. One being negative, the other being positive.
Well, I saw Bill Gates on Fox News a few weeks ago. He was being interviewed by Chris Wallace on their Sunday news magazine, and Chris, God bless him, asked him, I think a very relevant question. You're a big